Hi everyone, I'm Luke Henry. I am an accountant by trade, so don't hold that against me. I've been working in the game development space for the last 15 years, looking after a whole range of different studios. So today we're talking about being in the business of games and finding the revenue model of tomorrow. And it's really about, I suppose to some degree, reflecting on where we've come from and taking away some of those themes so that we can look at what the future's going to look like. Supporting me today is Jake. Do you want to stand up, Jake? And feel free to hassle Jake later on. I'll claim most of this as my content, but Jake really wrote a good chunk as well, so he's been very helpful. Okay, so we're away. All right, so there's a little bit about us. You'll see us out there. We're actually sponsors for the event, and we've been sponsoring GCAP for the last few years. So if you need to find us, we shouldn't be too hard to find. Okay, so let's talk about why revenue is important. Revenue and, by extension, cash inflow is the lifeblood of a business. So we are all, I think, here today to be involved in a business as opposed to a hobby. So there's going to be a commercial element to that. The sad fact is, I'll start with the stick, the scary bit. Half of all Australian businesses fail in the first 3 years operation. That's an Australian Bureau of Statistics quote from 2017. So it's a little bit daunting. So really the main reason why a lot of these businesses fail is generally is cash flow, and they're not able to get revenue through the door at a time when they're incurring costs. I'm sure everyone in the room can appreciate that, particularly in the industry that you're in, that it tends to be very back-ended, the revenue, in a traditional model. The reason why looking forward into the future is super important is because there's a massive amount of change out there at the moment. So consumer taste, the technology, even the regulatory environment. You've got things that are happening in the EU that are starting to impact even developers here in Australia now. And even just interactions with other businesses. It's moving at an incredible rate of change, and it means that there's a need for us to stay focused on that commercial element. So we'll talk through a little bit of the history. I know the theme of the conference today is about the future. We'll get to the future, but I'm an accountant. I always like to look backwards at last year first. So we'll indulge in a little bit of retrospective and then step forward from there. So really that past will provide us with some themes that we can use to draw on what tomorrow is going to look like, or that revenue model of tomorrow. And the last point is, welcome, come on down. You can sit at the front if you like. Monetisation, revenue and profit are not bad words. Okay, I know some people find that a little bit jarring, but they're not bad words per se. And the reason for that is it's important for you guys as business participants to generate a profit, generate revenue, so that you can pay wages. And that's what we're really about, is being able to make a sustainable industry. Okay, so hopefully everyone can agree with that. All right, I can't see what I'm clicking, so hopefully we're all right. So where do we start? In the early days, it was predominantly, certainly in Australia, a lot of the development scene was business to business. So it was a developer for hire model. Certainly overseas parties generally would be coming into Australia. They'd be investing in a team. That team would develop a product. The product would go and sell. It worked really well because the revenue was generally up front. So you'd be on a commercial arrangement. B2B is business to business. Okay, so you may have a consumer at the end zone or end product in mind, but the reality is that when you're actually in the business, you're talking with another business partner. There were few participants. There wasn't a lot of IP back then, and generally the reason for that is there were huge barriers to entry. The dollars required to set up a team and to fund and invest in it were significant, and it was also new. So there were few participants, there were really few genres, platforms were quite limited. The medium transition from essentially play in an arcade type environment into the home, so some people here would have had an Atari or something like that. Some people look a little bit too young for that. That was certainly very early in the piece, and it transitioned from there into other consoles. The home PC was a big changer. And what we saw there was the shift from these bigger teams to the opportunity for local developers to start producing their own content. That was where it first changed across to a B2C, so business to consumer type model. Titles would be sold off the shelf. It was all very retail focused. You had full access to the game based on one single payment, okay? And the key was that being able to maintain revenue and build it really relied on you being relevant and staying on the shelf. So you had to convince, what is now the EB Games of this world, that you deserve that prime product spot right at eye level in the new release category and hold that spot for as long as possible. Had a huge bearing on your ability to drive revenue. Oftentimes these things are a little bit out of your control. So, you know, where you ended up on the store, your ability to influence that was going to be limited, and there were a few players that were very, I suppose, effective at establishing those sorts of relationships that gave them that brand power. You would largely rely on that upfront spike in sales to fund the future of your business. So if anyone came to my talk last year, I talked a lot about the model of revenue and what it looked like. A traditional game, you see this huge spike right at the start as everyone buys the game because it's been marketed really well, and then it drops off quite quickly and goes flat, right? So that was a traditional model, and what we relied on from there is essentially you needed to really drive that spike up high. So you needed big impact day one, okay? So that's where you had this idea of blockbuster titles coming in. Eventually you got pushed off the shelf and then your revenue just fell into a hole and died completely. So really that revenue was only going to last for a small period of time. Got a question?
No, I'm just
So what will happen is that your development pipeline might be 12, 24 months, even longer in some cases, and your revenue might only be really there for a 3 to 6 month window. What happened from there is, of course, that people recognise the fact that brand power is going to have real clout. And once you've got IP and established a customer base, sequels become really popular. And it means that your spike is able to drive up much higher because you've got an established customer base that's there ready to go. It also had a feed-in effect in that it allowed your original titles to suddenly come back to the fore and perhaps get space in a storefront. So it created this concept of what I almost, we sort of refer to as peaks and gullies. So it was this idea of spikes up, go flat for a bit, then you get little spikes up again on a particular title and go flat again. And that proved a real challenge for a lot of studios. The industry is littered with the skeletons of studios past that haven't been able to manage that peak and trough type approach of revenue, and that's been a real challenge ever since. A couple of other points in terms of retail sales. What we see now is that second-hand sales, particularly on consoles and the like, really cannibalise the developers' profits. And it's certainly relevant in that particular point in time that piracy was a massive problem. And so we had the evolution of a lot more security around titles. Okay. Welcome, come on in. So then, along came the internet, and it was a paradigm shift. Bringing the internet into home created an opportunity for the market to massively expand. Games are incredibly expensive to produce, as everyone is well aware. So if we can extend that revenue and build it out, it's much more likely that a particular studio can generate profits. So it became a shift into what we now see as this idea of DLC content. And what that did is it extended the life cycle of titles. Studios didn't need to go through the process of totally redeveloping what they're doing. They were able to use existing assets, existing engines, and build that on to create a content that a ready available market and consumer was looking for, and it would extend that life of the game. I think the key here is that without constant development and the introduction of new content, you would also have the same outcome as what you see in a retail environment where the newest shiny comes to the front. DLC allowed us to bring titles back into the foreground and have a resurgence. So we can allow for more of these peaks and gullies into the future, which is quite important. It allowed a lot of studios to change tactics and change the way that they engage with different parties. And even to some degree now you're seeing a lot of studios developing a plan in terms of what they're going to do. So day one release is never the full product. Rightly or wrongly. You also see the pay-to-play subscription model, which everyone's probably familiar with, has fallen into a dark hole of WoW at some stage. It was quite popular at the time. And just for reference, that game's been going since 2004. Steam itself, 2003. One of the first games I remember that used DLC effectively was a game called Total Annihilation. It was really innovative at the time, an RTS, and it involved downloads of individual units. So you could basically download individual units into your game and essentially refresh the way in which the game played. So it was quite groundbreaking at the time. So if done right, DLC provides an injection to revenue, and it means that, depending on the size of it, obviously, your revenue out of a particular title can expand rapidly into the future. That's contrasted with the pay-to-play type model, where it is a consistent piece. Revenue is just consistently through the years, and it really is really down to whether you can maintain the interest of your customer, which is an important takeaway. Ultimately, we're all doing that, right? We're looking to grab the attention of our customer. The challenge with that sort of model is you've got to retain the attention of the customer. With Steam, of course, some of the piracy elements started to drop away. There's a lot more secure systems in place, and those issues started to fall away. All right. So let's talk about the mobile gamer, and that is, whilst we say it's a recent evolution, the reality is that most people in this room have played Snake at some stage, and it was seen at the time as probably the first shift where games were seen to have value, and hardware was shipped with a title built within it. So the revenue model there was, again, is switching back to this B2B. So those games are really a bonus feature as such. Mobile was really important because in a traditional sense, it was really only wealthy families that could afford to own a PC to some degree, or middle class. The reality is that because of the way in which society has evolved, everyone has a phone these days. Even down to primary school age, you're seeing kids with effectively smartphones. So what it has meant is that there's a massive influx of new potential customers to the market, and you've seen that particularly in the casual space. It's led to what I think is mass-marketed solutions. So they're short soundbite content, so to speak. It hits the right spot at the right particular point in time, and unfortunately now has become very saturated. But there was a period of time there where people who were getting into the market early were doing very, very well, that first mover advantage. What we're seeing these days is a rapid evolution in that space. So probably more current things you're seeing are niche products, so actually targeted down to very specific segments. So not trying to target everyone, but actually saying, well, hey, my audience is this particular individual or class of individuals, and no one else is doing that. So I'm going to make it my stated effort to get my app, game, whatever it is, in front of that particular audience. We saw some interesting trends there. The early days, it was all about premium. It was, mirroring that earlier model that we had, where you would pay an upfront amount, you'd get access to the game. Then it switched across to the freemium model, which was essentially a bit of a trap, so to speak. The idea was to lure people in and keep them playing, but then also start upgrading and paying a little bit more as they go. And then what we saw the next leap was this shift into advertising. And the early advertising was really blunt. It was pop-ups, it was, banners, that sort of stuff, where you're almost, to a degree, happy to pay a little bit of money just to make it go away. And we saw that work effectively a number of times. The advertising created an opportunity because it meant that you could remove that barrier to entry. The big problem we have, particularly with casual games, is it's a saturated market. Any small barrier can be a real barrier to someone accessing the title. So cost was one of those barriers, and the freemium and the advertising model created that hurdle to get over, which was too much for some people. The more modern advertising solutions you see, everyone probably played Crossy Road at some stage just to see what it's about. I mean, that title was extremely successful because it integrated the advertising solution so effectively that you wanted to consume the content. And that was a big switch. It was actually listening to what the audience wanted. Not saying I'm not going to do something that's commercial and it's going to derive revenue, but I'm going to do it in such a way that you're going to want to participate. This idea is really important, and the concept of bringing people along for the journey is important, because at times we can have this what I would call an ethical challenge here around, well, how much should an individual pay for a game? And talking to some people out there that produce titles that are really designed to scale with a user's desire and desire to experience it, and also capacity to meet the payment demands set out, creates this idea of whales. Has everyone heard of the term a whale? Right, so it's one person who will spend an inordinate amount of money on your title. And there's this push-pull idea here, is to some degree you want them, but you also don't want to become that evil, nasty corporation that's creating an addiction in someone. But those people are out there, and striking the balance between finding these people, enticing them to participate, and providing them value is really important. And the value proposition isn't necessarily in our eyes, it's perhaps more in theirs. The key with a lot of mobile titles these days we're seeing is that, particularly with an advertising bent, is that it's really about maintaining an audience for an extended period of time. So getting the title and then your revenue options in front of them as frequently as possible. So if you see a lot of the Facebook games, there's sort of pay to speed up. So you participate, you'll pay a little bit of money. It's a microtransaction, and it speeds up the content and enables you to participate in different ways. You're willingly buying in on that. The more modern versions, as we've touched on with Crossy Road, is about saying, how much can we integrate that content in the game? So if you consume an ad, will you speed up something within the game? And finding the right strike point with those particular barriers. The interesting concept is that these days we're living in a very connected society. So most people will spend their time connected online at some stage during their day. There'll be a few people that'll be looking at their phones or something like that, even now in the talk, which is okay. Or they're at a workplace and they're perhaps playing a game in their browser or something like that. So something to maintain their interest, right? And it's interesting because it's changing the dynamic slightly. It's meaning that businesses are looking at new ways to engage with that particular audience in a way that's not going to be entirely demanding of their time, but have small bite-sized pieces. And it's also meaning, because it's reaching further, advertising has far greater sway, okay? Because companies are increasingly looking for ways to get in front of their audience themselves. And advertising has, particularly in games, because people are so connected these days, plays a huge factor in that. And you can see that in everything, in Facebook, Instagram, those sorts of areas where the social element is coming through, and companies are very keen to get in front of an audience. Of course, there's a bit of a Blade Runner-esque sort of challenge there around what point is the advertising too much? Is it too in your face? Okay. So now we start to look at the more modern streams of revenue that we're seeing out there, and it's quite fascinating seeing the ways in which businesses are starting to evolve their revenue models to meet that audience demand and become a lot more targeted, but I would say, acting with a little bit more finesse sometimes. So we can see that advertising, as I mentioned earlier, is expanding rapidly and becoming increasingly important. And there's an opportunity for developers, I think, to reach into that space as a source of revenue, particularly because it addresses that issue that we have of this peak and trough type mentality. It can provide, assuming you've got a consistent player base, a consistent revenue the whole way through that will allow you to launch into the next title. So the most successful studios, yeah.
Did you just call that a peak and trough?
Peak and trough. Peak.
Peak, okay.
Peak.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just had to be clear on that. Thank you.
We haven't got to loot crates yet. That's coming.
Okay,
Yeah.
I was anticipating.
Yeah. So, microtransactions are important. Well, it's an interesting factor because you can see there where it can go so very, very wrong, right? Everyone's probably seen it in the media. But there have been other examples of that in the past. The auction houses of the past, there was an attempt there in, I think, Diablo 2 that they tried to monetize the platform and get a way in which they can extract a little bit more revenue out of their title. Very interesting. Consumers hated it, and it died very quickly. So much the same as our loot crate in Battlefront 2 example. But look, the key with those sorts of elements is that these microtransactions, again, extend the life of a title, and that's what we're always looking at. We want to get away from this early stage spike and then nothing to create a stream of revenue that's coming in on a recurrent basis. And that's going to enable people to have some degree of certainty as to what's there. They can pay wages and employ staff and all those sorts of things. You want to be able to employ those people because they're developing the next title that's coming through. The key here and the success in a lot of this is customer value. So it's really talking about the way in which we look at our particular consumers and what it is that they're valuing and they're after, and making sure that what we're charging for that is both reasonable in their eyes and also entices them to participate. I think there's interesting elements here because the loot box piece brings across this idea of a blending of the lines between sort of the gaming and gambling element. So we can safely say that side of it is probably a higher risk endeavour, but there's no reason why that model can't work in a particular title, provided it's articulated up front that that's what you're getting into and your customer base is buying into that. The last one I'll touch on, and I think to a degree worked well a couple of years ago, and now you're seeing very little of it, is this crowdfunding and to some degree Steam Early Access type model. So the classic Kickstarter campaign was there, it was fantastic, everyone jumped on board early, and there were certainly some big wins there that were had. I think a lot of people over time underestimated the amount of work that was required. It wasn't just to throw a title up, it'll print money early. It was attractive to a lot of people because it meant they could get that peak way earlier in the piece, so they weren't necessarily reliant on funding from a traditional retail sales channel. And it swung it back to this sort of traditional pay to acquire, your premium title type model. All right. So now we'll sort of talk about some of the new frontiers and some of the interesting things we're seeing out there. The gaming these days is transitioning away from its purest form of entertainment as such. So you're seeing a number of different revenue models essentially appearing. They're tailored to a particular audience, and then they're disappearing away. But gaming is starting to become a lot more relevant to a very, very broad audience. You're seeing it earlier today, we saw in the Unity talk, conversations around film, commercial elements in terms of being able to market and produce content around particular products. Then there's the more interesting areas that we've seen where a lot of governments generally, but also corporations, are using gaming to facilitate and create educational experiences for staff or consumers that better align with their interests. And it's key to this is understanding that a lot of it is reverting back to that B2B with the idea that there's a consumer off to the side. So we use the term gamification. Everyone would have heard this. And really we're talking about the application of the concepts that you apply in a traditional game development space, but taking that and applying it in a commercial sense. And you've seen examples of that here in Melbourne. There's 100 ways to die, 1,000 ways to die with the trains and public transport. There's a very interesting way in which they are able to take what you would consider some game elements and build that into a really important educational piece. And created a great opportunity for that particular studio in a B2B scenario where they're able to drive revenue and generally in those sorts of arrangements negotiate to receive some of that revenue up front so they can fund the costs of development. So super important to their cash flow. There are other areas. The not-for-profit space is seeing a lot of interaction in social issues, so workplace health, mental health, anti-bullying campaigns. And these represent a shift from sort of a release type cycle to an ongoing service agreement cycle. So you're actually signing on with these companies and entering into legal arrangements with them to provide revenue into the future. And I think this is a great area for a lot of studios, particularly if they're starting out, is to work in that B2B space to generate revenue and to generate cash flow in an early stage. So when we're building a revenue model into the future, what are some of the things that we really need to think about? Well, that first point I mentioned earlier is we're not always dealing directly with that end customer now. We're more likely to be dealing with other commercial parties, which requires us to sharpen up, okay? Really understand those commercial conversations that you're having and think about your profit position. It's still paramount that you're providing content that's going to be relevant to that end customer, but you're going to be dealing with some heavyweights, dare I say it, whether that's in an advertising space or distribution. Steam these days has transitioned now. It's such a saturated market that even just having profile is coming back to that old shelf space conversation, right? How do we get on that front page? How do we get on the front page of the App Store and get sponsored? So you're not going to do that just by producing a fantastic game. It's going to require you to meet people, build relationships with them, and sell a story, sell a value proposition to them. Slightly different focus. The distribution method for titles has changed rapidly. So we're seeing now, Steam is solidified as that central online location. The consoles are doing similar things. There's ongoing discussions around how they will integrate in the future. I think distribution will be very interesting. It's something to keep your eye on. Certainly, I know a lot of developers who were able to develop and get on the Switch platform. They were able to leverage that first to market. So being first on that sort of platform gives them a huge advantage. Requires an element of being nimble in business. The key often is do you try and tackle all platforms? And I think the argument would be, to some degree, no, unless you're going for a AAA title. It's certainly easy to say that it's far more commonplace to see revenue integrated within a game. You certainly see it in the casual space, but we are seeing it even in the premium titles with our earlier Loot Crate example, albeit not the best one. But we'll see constantly this sort of section evolving and people pushing new bounds as to ways in which they can engage and extend the life cycle of a game. So that where it once might have only lasted for a short few months, you're able to extend it and build it out so that you're getting long-term participation, and you can create that opportunity for whales, the idea that someone is wanting to spend a lot of money on a game and they've got the capacity to do so. It means looking at and reassessing a life cycle. With continuous content, you can extend it almost indefinitely, and I think we can say that's certainly been effective with WOW along the way. The other key challenge here we're starting to see is that, you know, barriers to entry are dropping away rapidly. It means that any small studio can, to some degree, put out content, but that's meaning that it's becoming a very, very saturated marketplace. And so there's a need there to determine really who that consumer is going to be. You need to be able to stand out and be relevant to that audience. And again, cycling back, those commercial agreements you're able to sign with other parties will help you in doing that. But just because there are more competitors doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing, because we're also seeing a rapid, massive expansion in our audience. I got the train in today, and I could see just across from me a number of, I'll say, people in their 60s who were using their mobile phone and playing a game on it. So 10 years ago, that would just never be expected. No one would be targeting an audience of that particular age group. But now it's readily available. So you don't have to target sort of the hardcore gamer, so to speak, but you can find a niche, find who that audience is going to be. And if you can distinguish them, if you can get in there early and hit that spot, that sweet spot at the right time, then it creates a great opportunity to drive more revenue. So the idea and where we look at to sort of take the conversation now is where to next. And what we can say is that the changes that we've seen over the last couple of decades have really shown how organic and dynamic that market is. There's new technology evolving every day. We're seeing a massive push at the moment in the VR space, and those titles that have been able to get in first and early have been able to take up market share quickly. And that's going to continue. That's a live and evolving area. So there's a great opportunity there for studios to get on at the ground floor and grow with the technology. But it's not the only thing. With rapid growth in this new technology, we can expect other change in the industry and within development cycles to accelerate. So we're seeing, engines become increasingly sophisticated. What Unity can do today is incredible compared to what it could do in the past. And it's meaning that there's an opportunity there for studios to produce content rapidly and fail fast. Everyone's heard that term, to fail fast. Making mistakes, learning from them, evolving the message, and coming at it from a different angle. It's super important to driving how your revenue model is going to come through. Because you may well become the next, Battlefront 2 with your first try, but then hit the sweet spot later on. And you can certainly see the success of where you hit that sweet spot. You can create huge longevity in a particular title and create a base of revenue that's going to continue for a number of years. When we think about revenue, that's to some degree we're disengaging revenue from a labour output, and that's often the biggest challenge for a number of people when they first start in business. They used to be remunerated by the amount of time they put in. But the key for a number of successful businesses is detaching labour from revenue. So it's about creating that longevity, creating that passive income stream, dare I say it. I'm starting to sound like a bit of an investment spruiker, but an element of business is looking at that in which you can provide passive value to your audience, okay? With this evolution of technology, the scope in which you'll be able to engage with audiences and consumers is going to change. So, You know, we talk about the Internet of Things, this idea that every inanimate object is to some degree going to be connected to us in a particular way. You know, it's possible very soon that you'll be playing a game with your fridge or something like that. And there's elements of that that start to create opportunities because someone is going to be in that space. Someone is going to be looking at it as a solution, and which they can engage with other businesses in generating revenue for themselves. The other trends that we've touched on there, you know, it's really important that we're looking at and staying abreast of some of these big themes. So gamification is a great opportunity there, particularly for studios that are starting out, who want to make a name for themselves and can enter into sort of B2B type arrangements. It's certainly, I know Film Victoria have been a great sponsor on the creative side of things, but there are certainly other government bodies that are interested in talking to studios. The concept of big data and the availability of it. It's more and more accessible. You can see from the various platforms, I was in the Steam talk earlier, it's incredible the amount of information that these platforms are able to derive and provide to you. So you can learn from it, learn from those mistakes, see what's working and evolve the message. And as we've touched on, the Internet of Things. So really looking at ways in which you can build in your solution with that broader environment around you. So that really covers off the main content of my talk. And I thought I'd put it out there to the audience for questions to get an idea of, or perhaps even if you've got some contribution towards it in terms of what you're seeing from a revenue model. Anyone got anything at all? Don't want to give away your secrets?
Sorry.
Sure.
One thing I'm sort of seeing that's missing from your talk is the rise of streaming.
Yep.
And I mean, that's not even a B2B model or a B2C model, that's influencers.
Yes.
Right, which is not, I don't know if we've seen any kind of degree of influencers, everyday ordinary people,
Yes.
having an influence on how your product sells.
Yes.
Possibly both to promote it, but also to possibly spoil it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, because it's a double-edged sword.
It is, absolutely. And we saw a number of those, a similar concept with a couple of Kickstarters that I assisted with, that very much the getting with the right people early created that marketing buzz that would enable our early spike to really kick off and provide a huge amount of funding early in the title's development so that you could really take it places. Look, I think to some degree streaming in the Twitch, is that sort of what you're referring to?
And others.
Yeah, I mean, look, I 100% agree. I mean, there's certainly the esports area in particular is a growing space. I would argue that it is a particular audience that you're targeting there. From an esports perspective, I haven't seen a lot of people do extremely well outside of, you know, those main titles, so to speak. So it tends to be more of a third-party type where you're producing content that supports titles, but then it's not coming back to the studio per se. Have you seen it work another way?
Yeah, I've just off the top of my head, I mean, Behavior is an example of somebody who does Dead by Daylight and where they'll actually get their influencers and put them in the game, and then that allows them to promote further.
Yeah.
I mean, to take a simple concept of game when it first started out to where it is 2 years later and it's still booming with, because of the draw that the influencers are having on the marketplace.
Yeah.
I mean, I go to watch a movie. I don't go to watch a person watch a movie.
No.
Right? It's
Well, unless you're watching, is it Google Box or whatever
I
it is?
mean, maybe commentaries, I'm sure, but that's the extra track. And I don't think we've ever seen media consumed like this before.
Yes.
And that certainly would go towards that future revenue model of finding that next revenue stream in terms of our business.
And the challenge is how you integrate that, I think, because you can build to that particular audience and you can, if you're looking at them as a source of revenue, then that becomes an interesting challenge because you need a way in which you can monetize it with that particular audience or that particular participant. So it ultimately falls back to then, are you having that sort of relationship with them from a marketing standpoint?
Yeah.
Are you seeing it? Yeah, it's totally promotional.
Right.
And I would agree in that instance. I mean, certainly the time that's required now to direct and invest in marketing is accelerated, particularly because it's such a saturated market now. You know, you need a way to stand out, and the influencers. This is one of the elements of change that we're seeing. The influencers are creating huge impact in that space outside of traditional advertising models. So it worked quite well with Kickstarter originally, and now no one really is interested in it because the influencers become that was the development of it, the source you're after. Yeah.
This is slightly related, and I don't know if you've got figures on it, but certainly when I've been talking to VivePod,
yep.
There's been a lot of discussion about a move away from the Steam storefront type situation.
Yes.
You buy a game on Steam,
yeah.
and instead you buy something like a Spotify subscription.
Yeah.
And instead of buying an actual game, you buy 80 monthly hours or something of
yep.
play, and
yep.
you split that among titles, in which case you would effectively have like a syndication model where you release content.
Yep.
And different zones can pick up, like a TV network can pick up your content and distribute it.
So
it's any figures on that sort of stuff.
I haven't seen anyone doing anything in that space at the moment. I mean, you see, there's certainly sort of the idea of bundling as titles is certainly there, but not in a like a pay-to-play type model as such.
I know VivePod was seriously looking at that just because, at least when I don't work in the VR space, and that's the Beat Saber, you really rarely, or VR chat, you rarely get a VR game exclusively. Yeah. You actually want to play VR time. Like, you normally partition in a certain amount of time per day to play in VR.
Yes.
And it's more like, I just want to have 40 minutes of something.
Yeah. Well, I think the statistics that I've seen have sort of suggested that even just VR play time is much lower than your traditional participation.
And you not be like, I want to buy a game. You're more like, I want to buy.
Yeah, just access. Yeah. Look, it's an interesting one. I think certainly there's an opportunity there, particularly if you're able to bundle with a number of other titles that are going to produce content that's going to be relevant to a particular audience. The key, and you have to have a look at the commercial arrangements that are there as to what's your slice of the pie, so to speak.
Yeah, that's why I don't know what the figures are. I don't know if networks, that was always like a tenuous channels you signed with them.
Yeah. And I think it becomes more important because the pie is so great. It really comes back to, and I'll emphasise this, know your audience. So really who you're trying to target, is that the right medium or the platform that's going to attract a particular person that you think will be interested in your title. And that's a hard one because you've got to speculate to a degree. It might not be the person you expect, right? But you never know. Yeah. There's some interesting trends we're seeing starting to come out of it in the context of international markets. So the fact that these digital platforms are enabling and getting greater access in, say, China is the big changer. We're seeing a huge amount, just talking about business in general, I'm seeing a huge amount of interest in businesses locally that take content that's produced in Australia and adapting it for a Chinese market. And that's an untapped segment to a degree, so it requires thinking about localization, even thinking about the sort of the cultural elements and making it so that it's not a insensitive type content, so to speak. Any other questions? Yeah.
VR is another one. VR in China, they're doing a lot of arcades and things like that,
yes.
Which is, I guess, licensing content to the arcades. How does that model work?
Yeah,
old school.
It is, isn't it? It's going back. I mean, you start to see a lot of these trends recycle, and that's what I was alluding to, that even the Kickstarter element to a degree is a return back to the premium type retail model.
Well, there's a hardware requirement with the peripherals that go with
yes.
the game and things like that.
And it makes it a lot more accessible to a particular audience, particularly given the upfront investment in hardware required.
It's also trying to solve that problem about solo experience versus the zeitgeist, which is that people want to participate in a group and
yes.
Solo experience, but if you can take people into an arcade or something like that, and it's also a better financial model because you're getting that through turnover.
Yeah.
Which is why those things
which is particularly required if you've got a huge amount of investment in infrastructure there. It's interesting you say that because my experience with VR has always been in a social environment. I don't know whether anyone's got it's anecdotal, I suppose, but I believe that yeah.
I think it's the tension with that particular piece of technology.
Yeah.
Why people feel that it's just a stepping stone on the road to really AR, which is a much more integrated, more sociable
solution.
construction solution.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see where that goes in the future. I think there's definitely some opportunities there for development. I suppose at this stage it's just a question of where is it heading and are you leaping too soon? Yeah. Any other questions?
So what's the revenue model tomorrow?
You have to become a client to know that. No. Look, I honestly don't know. I think what I'm seeing at the moment is that there's a massive amount of B2B type engagement, and I think the real challenge with your consumer model is that it's such a saturated market out there at the moment. So unless you're really hitting the point right at the cutting edge, you're either first to market or you're not really in the running. So looking at opportunities to become integrated with a particular brand or a partner that's going to be able to leverage and help you get the content out to a broader audience is going to be increasingly valuable.
I'm just going to go the other way.
Yeah.
I think it's the monetization of content creation.
Yeah.
Where everybody's going to be their own content creator. I don't necessarily have to work with a big company. Yeah. And whoever can harness that to be able to turn that into a marketplace. Yeah.
Then look, and there's no right or wrong answer with this. I mean, I'm happy to be told I'm wrong. I think the key with content creation is that someone's got to create the platform still. So it's just a question of are you the platform creator or are you a content producer? Yeah, or both. Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
So speaking on those lines.
Yeah.
I come from a cybersecurity background.
Right.
So we look into a lot of tokenization because of the crypto market as well.
Yeah.
And as you speak, I'm dealing with a lot of people, including my wife apparently, who's trying to make something around the gaming industry.
Sure.
For, as this gentleman just said, creating their own tokens.
Yes.
As a form of monetizing that game
Yeah.
on a platform.
Yeah.
That will, like, yourself creating your own coins for,
Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see where that goes because we saw with the Diablo 2 sort of auction house model where in-game currency and the conversion to real-time currency posed a whole lot of problems, huge problems. It's a bit of a regulation element, in fact, in terms of money laundering. I know that's certainly a problem in the Steam platform at the moment. So where that will go, I mean, perhaps cryptocurrency offers a more stable environment to enable that. I'd just be very careful of crypto is a bit of a buzzword.
Very early stages. It's not a good time in the market at the moment. No. But it's getting regulated as we speak, hopefully.
Yeah.
It's still too early to tell.
That's right. Yeah. We're starting to do a little bit of work in the crypto space with some fintech developers, and it's fascinating to see where it goes. But there's some Goliaths playing around in it.
Absolutely. Whales.
Yeah. Well, that's right. Yeah. I think that requires a degree of sophistication. There's no reason why you couldn't get into that space, but you want to know what you're getting into, particularly with the financial regulations that are at stake. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. I hope I was able to pass some value across to you. If you've got any questions you'd like to ask afterwards, feel free to come and have a chat with Jake or myself. We can talk about anything. We're not just limited to revenue. We can talk about any sort of business issue. All right. Thank you.